Well, hello. Welcome back to the second lecture of Nyack Heritage. If you'll remember, last time we covered A.B. Simpson's path, starting up in Canada and then going to Louisville, Kentucky, and then ending up at the 13th Street Presbyterian Church. And he was there for a year and experienced a little bit of change in his understanding and thinking. And so as a result of that, um, he began to think about what was next. And part of that was that he was beginning to reach out to the Italian dock workers. And as they came to Christ, his church wasn't as accepting of these people as he wanted them to be. He also began to question infant baptism as he was seeing it in Scripture. So there were just a number of areas where he was thinking through these things. And so he decided that maybe it was time for him to move on. But now he's going to stay in New York City, but he's going to do something different. So let's follow that pattern a little bit if we can go on through this PowerPoint. So after he had experienced healing and baptism in 1881, Simpson's new views led him to leave his comfortable church and he would step out in faith. If you remember, I told you that he had a good salary, $5,000 a year, which would be the equivalent of having $150,000 to $160,000 salary today. So he was pretty comfortable. His wife was not real excited about him giving up that comfortable job and moving out from there. He placed a newspaper ad announcing a meeting in a rented hall, and only 7 individuals attended. But within a few weeks, he was able to organize a small group of 17 faithful members, and things began to grow from there. Simpson had to find another way to support his family, and so he did that by writing. And soon he had books and pamphlets and different things coming out, and his influence was beginning to spread around the globe. In 1882, the Gospel Tabernacle was officially organized as a church. Though there was no real intention to start a church, he began to realize that this was probably the inevitable. But the new converts who were being reached for Christ and under his ministry were to have the new nurture, they needed to develop fully as disciples of Christ, and he needed a church to do that. So he brought them in as members. The Tabernacle became a center for evangelism and a variety of endeavors that were ministry oriented. So looking at a couple of those, one was the Baraka Homes. It was basically a rest home dedicated to divine healing, opened in Simpson's home in 1883, and then from there he began to find other places where he could establish these. Basically, it was a place where people could come in, they would be cared for, they would find rest, they would be prayed for, they would be counseled. It was just a place for people to get the soul care that we talk about today. And for some of them, there was some miraculous divine healing. For others, it was just through being in a healthy environment and being able to be established as human beings in right mind and body. He established a home for fallen women, which was an attempt to give them an alternative to life on the street. So he was reaching out to prostitutes in New York City. He certainly didn't carry out this ministry himself, but found others that saw the need and were able to carry on that ministry. He started several rescue missions that were opened in 1885 to minister to people on the street, people that were down on their luck. And in 1886, an orphanage was opened. It, like the healing home, was named Baraka, meaning blessing. So you can see there's a lot of things happening. Like I said, these weren't his primarily things that he did, but he found people and empowered them and released them to minister. So if you want a good example for ministry, that's a good example to look at. We can accomplish a lot more when we're empowering other people and equipping other people and releasing other people to do ministry. So a lot of these get attributed to A.B. Simpson, but he was not the one carrying them out. During 1891, a Door of Hope mission for girls was organized, so you see that he saw the needs. The Gospel Tabernacle was a place that was also a launching pad for sending missionaries out around the world. In 1882, Simpson established a Bible training school, the first of its kind in North America, and this is now Nyack College. So you're studying at something that was founded by him as a place to train people to prepare them for ministry, primarily around the world, but also in North America. In 1883, Simpson and the Gospel Tabernacle began an organization called the Missionary Union for the Evangelization of the World, which was not too successful. In other words, this was a missions organization that was designed to send people out. In November of 1884, 5 missionaries sailed for Africa. They had little training, no plan, no infrastructure to support them. On the way, the leader died, and 3 returned, and 1 joined another mission. So you and I would look at that and we would go, wow, that was a fail. Yeah, it was. What do you think you do with failure when it happens? You can do one of 2 things. You can go, you know what, I'm not trying that again. Or you can look at it, study it, see what needs to change in it in order for it to be successful. And that's what A.B. Simpson did. So he it was just a beehive of activity, if you would. He had things going on here in home, and he had things going on around the world. His writing and speaking engagements were being spread all over North America, and his influence was beginning to really become well known. Simpson organized and spoke at conferences, and he had a 2-prong emphasis in his ministry in that day. The one was the deeper life, which he called the Christ life. Basically, he saw, or we could call it a holiness movement. He was part of that movement. He saw that there was more to the spiritual endeavor than just getting saved, but that one was to follow Christ and to grow in sanctification, to grow in what it means to follow Christ. And that would happen under the power and the influence of the Holy Spirit at work in us, producing the life of Christ in us. His second prong aspect that he would often be asked to speak on, or that he would want to speak on, was missions. He wanted to get the gospel around the world. In 1886, W.E. Blackstone of Chicago, Illinois, was one of the Bible teachers at Old Orchard, Maine, and his topic was speed the message far and wide and bring back the King. So as we talked about in the first class, the first lecture, what would you do if you could hasten back the return of Jesus Christ? Well, that's where A.B. Simpson got his motivation. When he heard this message, he really bought into it and said, you know what? We need to evangelize the world. Everybody needs to be reached so that Jesus Christ comes back again. In 1887, 2 organizations were formed at the Old Orchard Beach. The Christian Alliance was organized to promote fellowship and the study of the deeper life in the homeland, and the Evangelical Missionary Alliance was established to send missionaries overseas. So this was his second attempt to start a missions organization that would get the gospel around the world. Now he's providing better training for the people. There was more infrastructure. He had learned from the first situation and was now ready to see it unfold in a healthier way. So here you can see a picture of the Gospel Tabernacle, which is now John's Pizzeria near Times Square. If you go in there, you can still see some of the things that would give evidence to the fact that it was a church. The picture on the bottom there and the left kind of shows the style that this thing was. As you can see, it looks a little bit like Simpson Hall, if you were. With the balcony up there. He wanted to provide a means by which the preacher would be close to the people. And so therein lies the style that he was able to establish for the Gospel Tabernacle. Think about the following. What risks did A.B. Simpson take to start the Gospel Tabernacle? All right, so think about it. He risked, first of all, supporting his family. All right, he's given up a big salary to now having to be basically a freelance writer or speaker, that kind of thing, to make his living. So that was one risk. He risked moving out of an established denomination to start something that was going to be who knows what. It became a movement, but not all things that start out small like that become a movement and then become a denomination. So he's leaving the stability of a denominational structure to be able to move on. In what ways was it a good choice? Well, you can see that things are starting to happen because he's got a little more freedom, because he can start some things that maybe his church didn't want to start before. You saw a lot of them were to the down and outers, and the church that he was pastoring was to the people that were maybe a little more upper class and not interested in reaching the down and outers and growing their church in that way. How should a person determine whether they should take a risk or not? So, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts? How should a person determine whether they should take a risk or not? So, if you've thought about that, um, jot your thoughts down, send them to me in an email, and I'll try to give you a couple extra credit points where you're missing something this week. All right, so give some thought to that. Simpson and the Alliance, 1891 and 19. The Christian Alliance was to be a simple and fraternal union of all who held in common the fullness of Jesus, promoting the deeper life, established emphasis of the fourfold gospel. So the Christian Alliance was one of those organizations that he founded, and it was just supposed to be a non-denominational movement that just got people thinking about promoting the deeper life, promoting holiness. So he didn't want to create churches in all these different cities, but as these branches, as they called them, began to form, groups of believers from various churches gathered together, like on Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, where they would meet together and they would talk about this topic of holiness and the deeper life. The branches met Sunday evenings so that people could worship in their churches, but as these branches were formed, they also began to have missionary conventions that were held in these U.S. cities and in Canada. And increasingly, these branches started to function more like churches. And that's when things began to grow to a level that A.B. Simpson never had intended for them to. He wanted them to be a grassroots organization that would just kind of encourage all churches to grow in this area, but the branches that were formed began to function as a church. The Evangelical Missionary Alliance, which was the second group, was to carry the gospel to all nations with special reference to the needs of the destitute and the unoccupied fields of the world. So he's caring about the needy people of the world and the unoccupied fields of the world, so countries where the gospel has been reached. In only 4 years, there were 15 missionaries out in the field. In 1891, Simpson called for 100 new missionaries immediately to advance the cause. This was the beginning of a major thrust to quickly put missionaries in the field. Okay? To do this required adequate finances, so this was also the year that they saw the first use of the missions pledge, where people would fill out a card saying, I pledge over the next year to give this amount of money so that they could send missionaries around the world. By 1895, there were approximately 300 Alliance missionaries overseas. In a period of just 4 years, the Alliance missionary force grew from 15 to 300. That's pretty amazing. Increasingly, the focus of the whole alliance was on maintaining this large missionary force. In 1897, the two organizations joined and formed the Christian and Missionary Alliance. So we have these two organizations with two distinct purposes that all of a sudden begin to take shape, and they're moving in a faster way than A.B. Simpson even envisioned. And there's a need to see this beginning to function so that they're synergistically working together. As a result, those two were merged together, and the Christian Missionary Alliance really became a denomination at that point. In 1897, a large piece of land on the banks of the Hudson River outside of New York was purchased. The Baraka Healing Home and the Missionary Training Institute were moved out of New York City to Nyack. So there's how we ended up at the Rockland campus, which I understand is going to be coming to a close. But God used it for that time, for a long period of time, and for a particular purpose. And his desire was that this would be a place to raise up world Christians who were world changers. Um, so the Baraka Healing Home was down at the bottom of the hill. It at a particular time ceased to function and was eventually sold. So you can see where things have happened along the way. We have to remain flexible in any vision, don't we? We have to allow God to allow things to be raised up, and when their time is finished, to let them drop down as well. Under Simpson's leadership, the early CMA becomes more organized and starts to look like a denomination. In 1906, with the Azusa Street revival and the beginning of a modern Pentecostalism, we see some changes coming about for the Alliance as well, because A.B. Simpson was very charismatic, but he did not go as far as the Pentecostal movement did. And so there was a parting of the ways at that point, and the Pentecostal movement took shape in the form of the Assemblies of God and some of the other Pentecostal churches in that day. And the Alliance continued to be basically an organization and a movement that was focused on the deeper life, focused on the work of the Spirit and the power of the Spirit and the Christ life being worked out in us, but not to the same degree as the Pentecostal movement. I am grateful for the Pentecostal movement and see what God has done through the Pentecostal movement in our day and age in the past 100 years and how it's grown around the world. It's just phenomenal. So this is absolutely no criticism of the Pentecostal movement. I believe that God has used it in powerful ways and ways that we can learn from and we can grow in the Alliance of which I'm a part. Simpson retired in May of 1918, and he was teaching at the college at that point, still traveling and teaching around the country. And but he retired in May of 1918. Missionary Training Institute in 1897. That's what Simpson Hall looked like. All right, not much different. When it was torn down to its stone foundation and then rebuilt, they tried to maintain the look of the original building. This is Partington Hall back in 1913. You can see that A.B. Simpson sitting outdoors on a homemade chair there, but that's Partington Hall as it was in 1913. And A.B. Simpson, as you can see from here, and this thing, October 30th, 1919, this appeared in the New York Times. The obituary for A.B. Simpson, pastor of the Gospel Tabernacle in 8th Avenue. He died at the age of 74. Some things that were said about him, that he could raise money for missions very easily with his passion and his just the way he was gifted at communicating and articulating the vision. There were often times when gifts of $50,000 were raised at a single meeting. So that was a significant passion of A.B. Simpson, and God used him in that day and age. Simpson's funeral. This is there at Nyack. You can see this is now the road that runs in front of Simpson Hall and Partington Hall that we call South Boulevard, and the stairs that go up there to the hall up there. So think about these questions. Discuss your thoughts and impressions of A.B. Simpson's life and ministry. If you could write your own obituary in the New York Times, what would you want it to say? All right. So just think about that. No, you don't need to submit anything. Just something for you to think about. I want you to think back on A.B. Simpson's life and ministry, starting up in Canada, where it was obvious that he was gifted and talented. He then moved to Louisville, and there he experienced the filling of the Spirit and the the fact that he could not do it in his own power. So, understanding that Christ was his sanctifier, and then going to New York City, the 13th Street Presbyterian Church, and how he sought to reach out to the poor and the needy, especially the dock workers, the Italian dock workers. He experienced his divine healing at Old Orchard, Maine, and realized that he was beginning to cause some unrest in the Presbyterian Church. Broke away from there, but now he knows that Christ is his healer, and and then he's filled with this passion for bringing back the King, and he starts the Gospel Tabernacle and this missions movement, holiness movement. So you can see along the way how his theology was changing and enlarging and growing, and that happens to all of us. We become aware of the truth of God's word, and we change. And so don't get so anchored in your theology that you become unchangeable. Um, we should always be willing to allow God to push us out a little bit further and see things differently. So when you look at his life and ministry, there's some lessons to be learned there. If you could write your own obituary in the New York Times, what would you want it to say? All right. Sometimes I think I want it to be as simple as he made a difference in people's lives that he met along the way. Okay. I don't know what you would want it to say for you, but just kind of think through that. So, for your assignment, you are asked to look at A.B. Simpson's covenant that he wrote back when he was 15, to rewrite it in your own words, in English, in common English, today's English. So rewrite his covenant with God, and then write one of your own. And like I say in the lesson, I'm not writing it more on so much on content. Make an effort, though. What would you want to say to God? What are you willing to covenant yourself to? So do your best with that. Again, you won't be counted off if it's not as deep as A.B. Simpson's, or doesn't sound as spiritual as his, or your next door, or your neighbors, or anything else. Okay, do your best with it. Thanks, and we'll see you. Um, if you if you want, you can click on the link. I think it'll open up for you, and you can do the fivefold survey. It'll give you some insights into your own life. Okay. So here you see the description. You'll see it on the lesson plan as well. So I want you to put that in the Dropbox when you finished it.